A good afternoon to everyone. I am genuinely pleased to be able to present the topic of biological maturity here as well, a topic that I find very fascinating and intriguing, and I hope to be able to lift you out of this little afternoon slump. Currently, as part of a doctoral thesis, we are conducting an EU research project with the University of Saarland, Hannover 96, Water Poznan, and also a university in Poland. The aim is to make the topic of biological maturity more prominent in order to create equal and fair conditions, especially in the youth sector, and thus to optimally promote talents. And I have the opportunity to make the topic of this EU project, biological maturity level, more prominent in Germany, and I am also in frequent exchange with clubs. And when I talk to the club, I often have, similar to here, a very mixed audience, I would say. That means we have sports directors, physiotherapists, athletic trainers, scouts, similar to here, so it's very, very mixed, which is also a certain challenge for me to say, how can we present the topic in a way that everyone can take something from it, but also develop a fascination for it and say, hey, let's develop a clear stance to implement the topic with us. And yes, for me, I would say over time, the best approach was to start by asking myself, okay, why am I here? What role do I play in an organization? How can I perhaps make my work measurable in terms of success? How can we approach the whole thing? And, oh, he briefly lost the connection to the server, which caused a temporary interruption in the process. If this had not happened, you would have needed to click the continue button to proceed with the next step. This kind of issue can sometimes occur due to network instability or other technical problems, but it was resolved quickly. What organizations outside of Germany have already clearly defined for themselves is the approach to say, okay, we want to develop players specifically for the first team, or also generate revenue from development, from youth work for our club. I have not yet encountered such a clear stance and positioning in youth work in Germany as strongly in exchanges with other colleagues. Overseas, it is definitely much more present. To give you an insight, for example, the head of the innovation department at Manchester City, whom I was able to speak with, told me that they can recoup 10 times their academy costs annually through player transfers. That means they always look at what they can do to professionalize themselves, to then also create better working conditions, to be able to nurture the best talents and thus optimally promote players. This becomes a motivation when I speak with sports directors to say, okay, why should we engage with this? To find an entry point into the complex world of a sports organization or a club, I would also like to invite you to engage with the work of Henriksen from 2001, who analyzed why Ajax Amsterdam is so successful in youth development. That means if you look at the last 10 years, they continue to be among the top 3 organizations in terms of revenue generation from player transfers from the youth sector, but also in terms of permeability. He looked at, okay, what are they doing differently there, where we gradually come to the topic of biological maturity. That means what we find there, what he describes, are very clear basic prerequisites, which include personnel structures and infrastructures as fundamental requirements, also to implement a certain way of working. But he also describes very clear processes, which we will delve into today, very clear processes that lead to the best possible development and promotion of players, whether on an individual level or through working methods that have an effect on the team level. This then leads to Ajax as a special construct, especially when you look at the culture there. That means what he did was to ask coaches as well as players, what is our mission, vision, where do we want to go, how do we want to work? But also asking the players, does that resonate with you? And what the club very clearly communicates externally, but also what the players actually feel, is that they are genuinely being trained for the first team, and that personal development takes precedence over success. We aim to develop youth individually, our priority over results. Many coaches agree when presenting the club, but it might not be the case with us yet. We need a stronger stance to implement it in our organization. And that every player is also seen as a kind of investment in order to be able to develop players for the first team. And from this construct of prerequisites, working methods and culture, which is also difficult to grasp but presented here for you, Ajax manages to develop players for the first team or make a profitable transfer. That means we are dealing with the topics of talent identification and player development. For those who want to delve deeper into this, I recommend the book, The Athletic Skills Model. That means the book presents Ajax's working methods in great detail. This was also my introduction to the topic of biological maturity, where the head of the department at the time presented their working methods. They had a good gut feeling about many things, saying, okay, we had players at different stages of development, maybe we need to consider them differently and place different demands on them based on that feeling. And now, as we stand here today and what I am presenting, many of the results that I will show you later confirm much of what was done very, very well back then. So if anyone wants a little push into the topic, I recommend the book. And he himself takes a clear stance and says that the evaluation, the measurement of the biological maturity level should be done by all organizations in order to best promote players. So the first question is, okay, what does biological maturity level even mean? We have already talked a bit about this, meaning the definition of biological maturity is ultimately the description of human development in terms of growth, where very clear individual variations can be observed regarding the timing of when it occurs, as well as the rate, meaning how quickly this growth happens. This means, for example, the development of a young adolescent, which is crucial in particular. This means we have the chronological age on one hand and the growth rate on the other. We will hear more about growth rate later, but just for you to take away, it is expressed in cm per year. This means we can see how the growth of a young adolescent develops, and there are clear moments that are recurring. This means it is to be expected in the growth process that at around the age of 12 years, as we can see here, there is a point where children grow faster. This is the point of entry into puberty, and a phase is reached with an increased maximum growth rate called peak height velocity, where children grow the fastest. This point, the onset of peak height velocity, also describes when a player enters this pubertal phase. That means what we are looking at here is an expected growth curve for young adolescents, where we have this point of peak height velocity, meaning the increased growth in height, at around the age of approximately 12.5, let's say 13 to 14 years. That means when we look at young adolescents running around outside, this is, on average, a growth pattern that can be expected, so to speak. But now, let's take a look at what happens in soccer, okay? Here, I have an outstanding study from the Portuguese region for you, where over 10 years, 110 children from the youth performance system of Atlético BBAO Wars were examined and monitored. And what you can always see there is definitely the strong individuality of the maturation process. That means in extreme cases, the timing of this peak height velocity can be significantly shifted to the left. That means the player is already growing, has increased height growth at the age of maybe 11 years, and is significantly more developed compared to his teammates. However, we also have the extreme case where some players experience this increased growth in height very, very late, perhaps at the age of 15 or 16 years, and then they are described and classified as late developers. This means that in extreme cases, when you look at the literature, there are differences in biological age of up to 5 years. When I talk about the topic of biological maturity, it is often mixed up with the relative age effect, which should not be done because the relative age effect describes when a player was born during the year, maybe in January, one in the second quarter, another in the last quarter, where we also have a certain difference in terms of the opportunities, how long someone has been in the world and perhaps has a bit more training experience. But here in these maximum expressions, we have a much stronger effect of differences of up to 5 years, found 2001. And to bring you another interesting and fascinating anecdote, we have a lot of various differences in the different age groups from U to U. That means, looking at this extreme example, this boy has already grown to his maximum, his growth rate is slowing down, and he is now growing significantly slower. Physically, completely different things are happening to him, also hormonally. On the other hand, we currently have players in the U who are indeed just coming in or are at their peak growth velocity. That means we need to very strongly consider each and every individual and address their needs in order to best effectively reduce injuries, as I had presented. So yes, this individuality that we have and this uniqueness that we need to pay attention to, especially in the age group U in a club where I spoke, was obvious to one coach. He said, yes, Lucas, exactly, that happens with us too. And unfortunately, I only had 8 players in training over the past few weeks because many players were having problems. Maybe this will help us to adjust things, as we will see later. That means, first of all, to give you the opportunity to see that this definition is indeed reflected in this way. We have different methods to assess the biological maturity level, which I will also present. That means the gold standard is examinations of the carpal bones, which naturally come with a higher cost. That means you often need external cooperation partners to carry it out or the equipment for it. That's why it isn't done very often. However, we also have the option of non-invasive methods to perform the whole process through calculations. And where, if you look at what is used the most, it is the Meerweit method and the Camus-Roach method. The Meerwald method, known to some of you, involves the interplay of standing and sitting height, which you might have performed. Is this the method most commonly used when talking with colleagues, even here in Germany? It is actually known that the Meerwald method for describing biological maturity is not recommended. Because what the Meerweit method unfortunately fails to achieve is identifying when the period of increased growth occurs, as it is very prone to errors. That means what it predicts for us when it will happen actually does not happen there. Therefore, this method is not suitable for working in a maturity-oriented manner. Therefore, it might be better to distance oneself from it to some extent. That means those who might be working with it could say, hey, maybe there are other possibilities which I will introduce to you, like the Camus-Roach method, which we will delve into shortly. Can you also provide something further for your coaches or scouts? When I talk to the club, it's more about encouraging them, saying, okay, we don't always need wrist examinations, we don't need complex projections, but that the coach or scout who is watching players can also gain confidence and say, okay, we know from studies that we can also subjectively assess relatively well whether a player is normally developed, significantly early developed, or significantly late developed. And if you look at, okay, how the distributions are in soccer, the selection system we have a lot of players who are very early developers that maybe now as a scout or as a coach who is looking at a player, okay, with this prior knowledge, but also with the courage to know that I can classify and recognize accordingly. I put on these glasses and then want to evaluate and consider the talent potential of the player, perhaps with a different perspective, 2001. That means inviting the coaches and scouts, not just for theory, but also to take it with you and apply it in your daily life. Now let's move on to the Camus-Roach method, the same method I used back then with Sam Pauli, to assess the maturity level of the players and to create maturity-adjusted groups. What is the idea behind it? That means the method also describes chronologically that at the age of 18, the player is at 100% of their adult height. That means the predicted or the forecasted adult height relies on accurately measuring players' height, players' weight, and the average height of both parents. This is then calculated and extrapolated using age-specific coefficients, allowing us to say, how tall will a player be in their predicted adult height? It is also known from various research groups that this measurement method has an accuracy of around 2.2 centimeters, and in some cases, even more precise results have been achieved. That means what was predicted actually matched the expected adult height. This is also extremely interesting for scouts, for example. They have said that for extreme positions like a goalkeeper or a center back, this is something they can really benefit from. When I then look, okay, where could this player play one day? Okay, he might only be 1.60 or 1.75 meters tall. Putting him in goal might not be the best position for him, but he has other good skills. How can we place him differently? That was a thought from a conversation at a club. The whole thing is based on, as I have provided you with the literature here, that simply, yes, in the early years, over 200 children were very, very meticulously followed from birth and were regularly measured to see how these children developed. To then derive from that simply, okay, how can we, if I have the height, weight, and the average height of the parents, how can I then accurately predict how tall this child will become in order to work with this information effectively? That means what the formula allows us to do is, I have a player, I have measured him, I have calculated how tall he will be, I have his current height, so I can then say, okay, I have his percentage of adult height, where he is currently at. The formula shows he will be 1.90 meters tall. He is currently at 1.65 meters, so he is at 85% of his adult height, which means he is before the pubertal phase, before this increased growth in height. We also know from studies that the timing of this peak high velocity, where children shoot up in height, is in the range of 89 to 92%. This means that around here is a very sensitive phase, as we will further elaborate on shortly. But we also have the ability to describe how far a player is from their final development, which is the definition of biological maturity. We describe the development of a player in terms of adult condition, so that we can then divide groups according to their percentage development, allowing us to train in a maturity-adjusted manner What is often done is that we create groups from U to U, as we have seen with the individual growth curves, where we say we make a group or groups that are prepubescent in the middle of growth, which we might need to observe more closely and perhaps protect more. And we have a group that has already passed this growth phase, where we might be able to introduce more intensive strength training, regardless of their chronological age, but rather adjusted to their maturity level. What is also super exciting for further classifying players is that through the age-specific reference values we can derive from this, we can very clearly say whether a player is early developed or late developed. That means, to make it a bit clearer for you, we now look at, okay, for a 12-year-old, it is expected that they are at 85% of their adult height, based on the reference values that were developed here with great effort. We now have a 12-year-old who might already be at 90% of his final adult height, so he is clearly very early developed, and we can classify players accordingly. And this might be very, very exciting for the athletic trainers among us, because when we conduct performance diagnostics, I was often asked by my colleagues, okay, where does the player stand in comparison to his team, his youth team, as an early developer? Yes, outstanding. He sprints past everyone. He outperforms them all. He is so much stronger in every performance parameter. But if we then perhaps compare him maturity adjusted with his group, where he would belong, 2001, he might not be such a high performer anymore. We can put his performance in a better context. The point of peak height velocity, which we have already mentioned a few times, is a time when a lot of growth and changes in the body actually occur. This means, once again, as identified by our colleague from Portugal in 2001, that when a player is in this phase of increased growth and simultaneously has a very high growth rate of more than 7.2 centimeters per year, which translates to a player growing faster than 0.5 centimeters per month, the player is in a situation where a lot of changes are happening in their structures, making them extremely susceptible to injuries. This means that we need to take a more targeted approach, to chronic issues like knee problems, groin problems, lower back problems, which players will also have long-term recurrent issues with. We should perhaps try to handle these more sensitively and make early adjustments. What is also interesting is what he found out, that you have different injury patterns as you approach adulthood, with more muscular problems occurring. Why do I think it's important to delve into this further? At the very beginning, we also addressed the economic aspect of player development and the value generation for the club for further professionalization. And again here, as I presented it, what you can see here is the number of injuries which simply increase rapidly between the ages of 14 and 16, as well as the severity of these injuries. This means that injuries are not only more frequent, but also the downtime is longer. This means that the players are not available for training and competition. And as I looked into it further, a study that I find fits very well into the context is a study from the Spanish region, where an academy was examined over 6 seasons to see which players actually made it to the first team. What stood out about them, and what can we perhaps identify as a key figure or metric that we want to work with as USANT? And what this study group from Spain managed to recognize was that all the players who made it from the youth sector to the professional sector had a match day availability of over 84%. That means when talking to coaches, sports directors, and heads of the medical department, I believe we have many interconnected areas to consider. So we need to look very closely at this sensitive area. In 2001, what we want is apparently to have the players available for a long time, not necessarily taking them out on game day, but rather adjusting so they can still stay in the system, allowing them to play. This increases the likelihood that they make it to the professional level, thereby generating value for the club. And I think these are topics that work well together, where you can say, okay, as an athletic trainer, I pass this information on to the scout, to the coach, which also helps the sports director to make further changes regarding posture and successfully implement them at the club level. There have been many so far. I find suggestions even from individual studies, where I was often asked, okay, Lukas, we have now learned, somehow taken away in this sensitive phase, we need to adjust. How can we adjust? And there is also a group, David Johnson, who has published a lot and has used the 3 markers that have already been published in other studies. This means he has generated a kind of decision tree for himself. That means if the club had a player who was in the maturity process between 88 and 92% of their adult height, and or had a total length growth greater than 7.2 centimeters, and or had length growth in the lower extremities. That means we simply measured standing height, arm span, and sitting height, and were able to see how quickly the lower extremities are growing. If two of these three factors were found, the training load and training content was simply adjusted consistently for this group or for the individual player. And what they achieved was significantly reducing injuries from the season they introduced this pattern compared to the previous season, significantly. However, it must be said that this season, where they achieved such good results, was during the time of Corona, which had a bit less game activity. But still, this is the only very concrete thing I have found so far that serves as a clear basis for decision making. When that is present, an adjustment happens, whether it's having a longer warm-up, more coordination aspects, because players, as coaches say, tend to lose their footing during growth, which was taken into account and apparently with a lot of success. I believe we have been able to cover the topic of talent development quite comprehensively. We still have the topic of talent identification, and for me, a major insight during my time at St. Pauli, it was also important to interview the players, because we can learn a lot from young adolescents. That means we also conducted training sessions adapted to the maturity level and asked the players, how is this for you? And do you enjoy it? What does it do for you? Do you want to work this way? And I found it simply amazing to learn from 11-year-olds how nuanced they can be about it. They told us, hey, if it helps my development, then I'm all for it. It might take something away from my home, from my team, but if it helps me, I'm up for it. Here, there is also a survey of players who have made it from the youth and senior levels from the English Premier League, known there as the Elite Player Performance Plan. And the players were asked, okay, how did you perceive your development indeed? And they said that they felt, especially in the youth sector, that a lot of emphasis was placed on speed, strength, and height, and relatively little on technical and tactical skills. This means that physicality was a very strong selection factor. And what is also known is that the biological maturity, whether early, late, or how far developed, is strongly associated with how the coach perceives the impact of a player on game day. This means that the more developed or early developed a player is, the more impact they have on game day, and the more talent is attributed to them because they are a game-changing player. 2001, what you can see here is once again the chronological age of a player, and here, using the example of sprint performance and counter movement jump performance, how performance capability develops. And what can be clearly seen here is that up until the age of 16, we actually have a linear development of this performance capability. This means that players keep improving until the age of 16, where this development might slow down a bit because physical differences have evened out, and we are all at a similar performance level. It is important to consider this individuality in the development curves we have shown, especially before the age of 16. That means, when asked as a strength and conditioning coach, how do you assess the performance results? Not necessarily comparing them to the team average, but actually considering the individual in terms of their maturity level, where they stand, and how their development is progressing. Furthermore, to take an even stronger stance, here is Towson, who provides a lot of insights regarding talent identification and talent assessment, also through small-sided games. He says the selection process should take place significantly later, with the cutoff for when a player leaves an academy being at 15 or 16 years old. This is because by then we know that physical attributes have adjusted, which helps to avoid losing late developing players and keeps them in the system longer. This is something you present to the club, where you say, okay, this would be a significant change in our decision criteria for when players leave the club, because that often happens much earlier over time. What do you want to achieve with such an EU project through awareness-raising efforts so that patterns like these can be broken? This means that what you can see here, around the age where most players enter academy systems, is that normally developed players continue to be present in the system, but late developing players are no longer found in the academy system. They have been completely filtered out. Early developing players who outrun everyone stay in the game. The question is whether those who are always physically stronger also feel the need to train themselves to be ambidextrous and work on it, because they simply dominate too much with other abilities. 2001, and the goal is to first take a step-by-step approach with the club to see how you are set up, how you are distributed, and how we can perhaps further break this down through the perspective to also involve the scouts or your coaches to make things easier for everyday life. This is the opportunity that player labeling offers. That means player labeling involves having game forms and assessing the biological maturity, as we learned in 2001, by marking the players with a bib and a number to make it clear to coaches and scouts which player is the most developed and which one is the latest developer. This definitely has a very strong effect on how talent is described by scouts and coaches. This means that what can be seen here is that scouts who were informed about what these numbers mean were significantly more likely to assign talent to late developing players than without this information about what these jersey numbers mean. That means what we also want to do in our project with Hannover 96 is to reproduce something similar with partner clubs, giving players bibs to classify who is the most advanced and who is the latest developed, in order to perhaps conduct an evaluation system differently and thus maybe also be able to keep more talented players in the club. It is also described here that the likelihood was simply higher to rate late developing players more favorably through such labeling. Something I have done over the past year and a half is to interview youth performance centers in Germany. So what is being done about it? How is it being implemented? And what you can see here is that I once asked athletic trainer colleagues, how does an adjustment to the biological maturity level take place? Most of what takes place here are strength-based sessions in the weight room, so small elements of a player's overall load. Sessions that take place on the field are very irregular or don't happen at all. And such maturity-adjusted training forms and competitions are actually not yet found in Germany, and according to exchanges with colleagues, are still not found. 2001.